Good morning and welcome back to today's discussion on Shelley's poem To a Skylark. In our last two discussions, we've spoken about uh, two of Shelley's major poems, including uh, to The Mask of Anarchy and Ode to the West Wind. And we've seen how Shelley is using different poetic forms in order to communicate uh, the reformist zeals of his poetry. We've also seen how Shelley has categorized the poet as a prophet and the way in which he sees poetry as an agent of both moving his audience and changing the universe. It is, therefore, with this perspective that we shall take a look at another major poem of Shelley, and that is To a Skylark. Let me share the text so that I can take you through the poem. I hope the screen is visible. Now, To a Skylark uh, actually talks about the ethereal happiness of the bird, its ability to sing unpremeditated, and its ability to be untouched by the trials and tribulations of human life. Now, a few small points before I enter the text. This poem, like The West Wind and The Mask of Anarchy, was composed around this time, 1819-20. Now, Shelley was at this point of time, this is 1820 actually. Shelley was in Italy. And Mary Shelley, while talking about the genesis of the poem, writes that this poem was conceived one summer evening while wandering among the lanes whose myrtle hedges were the bowers of the fireflies. We heard the caroling of the skylark, which inspired one of the most beautiful of his poems. This was then the history of the composition of the Skylark. Obviously, Shelley, at this point of time, was undergoing, as I pointed out, several crises, in the sense that his relationship with Mary Shelley was uh, extremely strained. There was an illness in the family, especially of his daughter. We've seen how Shelley was frequently suffering from delusions. And as he wrote in The West Wind, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Therefore, the strained poet versus the unconstrained skylark, the skylark which not only can soar into the distance, into another sublime universe, but it can also create a melody which is untouched by any sadness, right? So the happiness of the bird versus the constrained nature of the poet is one of the major, symbols, or one of the major themes of the text. Hail to thee, blithe spirit. Once again, notice that Shelley is here using the lyric form. It's the A B B. This rhyme scheme, once again, as many of you have pointed out, the kind of rhyme scheme that Shelley uses, the alternating rhyme followed by the slightly lengthened out Alexandrine, the iambic pentameter, followed by the slightly lengthened Alexandrine, which gives us the kind of soaring motion of the skylark, followed by the lengthened line, which then outlines the happiness of the skylark. Right. So Shelley uses this formal, address, hail to the blithe spirit, blithe as in carefree, bird thou never wert. Now that's very interesting in the sense of many of you must have been wondering, because all the major romantic poets use this metaphor of the bird I'll be looking at Wordsworth's Skylark in a short while. We've sort of read, not with me perhaps, but all of us have read, Keats's Ode to the Nightingale, and we've seen how the bird becomes a kind of a lingering metaphor of emotion which can soar, of a bird which becomes a symbol of sublimity, one which can soar from the earth towards something which is sublime, something which is unreachable to man. The bird, of course, the nightingale, and the skylark are also symbols of this romantic poet, right, who can transcend the real and enter into a zone of the unreal. And also, very importantly, you see, in Keats, for example, the nightingale is also this ambiguous symbol of the art which will be permanent, right? Something which does not fade, right? Also in Shelley. Therefore, this bird as the symbol of the sublime poet and as an image of sublimity is something that creates a tension between the real skylark, which is a physical bird, and the real nightingale, which once again is a physical bird, versus the what you can call the symbolic, sublime, idealistic concept of an art that is permanent and that is untouched by the constraints of the mortal world. Therefore, the operative word that you can find in Shelley and in Keats and in Wordsworth is celestial, blithe, immortal bird, right? So it is at the same time bringing to us the dialectical conflict between an art that takes off from reality and an art that achieves a sublime state which is beyond the real. So it is in this larger sense, you see, that the bird is never worth, the bird that never was, because the bird which actually sung and the skylark, which is the object, the symbolic object of the poem, are two different categories. That from heaven or near it, pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Now, once again, that those two words, I would like to linger on them. Profuse strains. So there's no kind of constraint, the kind of unprecedented spontaneity, unpremeditated of the romantic poet who can, sort of let the overflow of his creative urges, right? So the skylark is the unrealized, ideal, romantic sensibility that can transform reality into a continuous melody of harmony and unpremeditated art. So the very first stanza establishes the bird as a symbolic object of the romantic sublime poet. And then you have this motion, and you see how Shelley uses the bird's form, higher still and higher. From the earth thou springest, like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest. So once again, you can see the kind of rapid interplay of light and color that Shelley uses. The blue sky and the golden skylark, as it were, like a cloud of fire. Right, once again, fire, that is the symbol that Shelley uses in Prometheus Unbound, written in and around this time. The fire that is knowledge, the fire that is wisdom, the fire of a reality that is beyond the real. Now, here, of course, the operative philosopher that we will use is Plato, and the Platonic sense of the world of the pure idea, eidos, which can be plumbed only by the poet. Now, you will remember, of course, Sidney. And Sidney talks about the mortal world is brazen, whereas the poet's world is golden. Right? So the poet's as it were, uh, symbolic recreation, a new order of mimesis, where he can approximate the world of the pure idea, and the skylark becomes the object of that pure world of ideas. And singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. Right, so the inspired, imaginative poet. Right, so in that sense, the damsel with the dulcimer that Coleridge has talked about, or the kind of inspired romantic poet, be thou me impetuous one, that Shelley talked about in the West Wind, is the state of heightened sensibility and madness into which the poet sees, in the Platonic sense of the term, in the pure world of the idea. You see, Shelley will be talking about this world of light and gold. So the color scheme in Shelley is, of course, one of knowledge and wisdom. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, over which the clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run like an unbodied joy whose race is just begun. Once again, this concept of the unbodying of the skylark, the bodying and the unbodying. The skylark was the physical bird which Shelley and Mary Shelley saw. But what Shelley's poem does is unbody the skylark, make it a purely symbolic object that can sort of soar into the pure world of the ideas, into a world which is untouched by human grief, and into a purely imaginative universe. The pale purple, so this tension between the body and the unbodied, the tension between the profuse strains of unpremeditated art and constructed poetry, the kind of tension between the bird that is and the bird that never were, is the unresolved tension of the skylark. The pale purple, even, and you can see how the golden lightning now sort of deepens into the pale purple, melts around thy flight, like a star of heaven in the broad daylight. Thou art unseen, but I hear thy shrill delight. So once again, the bird that is seen versus the bird that is unseen. The bird that is seen is rooted, changed to the world, symbolic of the poet. And the bird that is unchanged, unchained, unseen, is the symbolic, romantic poet who can triumph over life. Keen as are the arrows of that silver sphere, the moon, whose intense lamp narrows in the white dawn clear, until we hardly see, we feel that it is there. So the presence and the absence, the presence of the moon, yet its absence as the dawn comes in, the presence of the skylark's song, yet its absence from our sight. So Shelley is, as it were, creating two different worlds. One, the physical world, and two, the world of art. And you see, this is the dialectic also of Keats's poems. The nightingale, the immortal bird, yet he's sort of grown into the world also. The physical nightingale versus the nightingale as the object of art. All the earth and air with thy voice is loud, as when the night is bare from one lonely cloud, the moon rains out her beams, and heaven is overflowed. This concept of spontaneity, this concept of excess, this concept of an art which can overwhelm and move, is at the root of romantic belief. Right? You see, Augustan art is the art which is measured, controlled, and which can reform. Right? So satire, which is meant to lash, the romantics produce a poetry that is overflowing with the sensibility of individual perception, and that is meant primarily to move the audience. Therefore, the heaven is overflowed, this force of poetry that Shelley is talking about. What thou art, we know not, You see, once again, this is the universe of the secondary imagination of Coleridge. Shelley's taken this primary object of the skylark, which all of us have probably seen, and then transformed and made associations with his mind and creatively transformed it into something that is beyond the real and beyond the understanding as well. Therefore, when Shelley is talking in the Mask of the Poetry about the spectre that rises to defeat anarchy, that column of light, which may be illumination, which may be freedom, which may be with the pure, undistilled world of poetry. So, this elusive yet overflowing, this unexplained yet present, sublime yet rooted in reality, object that art creates, space that art creates, is the space of the skylark. And therefore, it is unbodied. And therefore, what thou art, we know not. What is most like thee? From rainbow clouds there flow not drops so bright to see, as from thy presence showers a rain of melody. And then comes this image. And this, I think, is one of the climactic lines of the poem, right? And therefore, one of the most important messages that Shelley wants to pass in this poem. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought. You will remember in the defense of poetry when Shelley talks about the poet as the prophet, and the poet who can bring the world of the science and the ideas together. The word which is brazen is transformed into a golden, and therefore who can herald a future that is unseen and an utopia that is yet unrealized. Like a poet hidden in the light of thought. You see, this concept of the hidden skylark, the hidden poet, the hidden world of the idea, which is then transferred to the human world through the power of words and through the expressive, imaginative power of the poet, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Now, for this, take the example of the Mask of Anarchy, the Peterloo massacre, which Shelley saw, or rather read about firsthand, a world of abject dystopia, is then transformed by the power of the poet, the imaginative, prophetic power of the poet, to create the sense of a free universe, right? Which we have not seen, but which the poet has only conceived, and which is therefore becoming the ideal, the idea, the world of the ethos to which the world of the skylark and the romantic poet belong. Those of you who've read Dream Children by Lamb will remember Lamb and Mary Lamb in the throes of madness, talking about the dream children who will never exist, but whom Lamb can conceive in his essay. Right. So you could see, you can make these linkages, these dots between these romantic sensibilities to see how the romantic poet's world, through the poetic sensibility, through the poetic subjectivity, is the power of creating very, very, very imaginative and powerful utopias, right? And thereby move his audience. Now, for Shelley, it's not really important to create this utopia for himself, but also move his readers through the lyric form to attain this utopia. Like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, and you will see this concept of the unseen, embedded, unfree, that is enclosed, which the skylark liberates, as it were, through a series of similes. So like a high-born maiden in a palace tower, soothing her love-laden soul in secret hour, with music sweet as love, which overflows her bower. Right, so the song of the imprisoned maiden. Like a glowworm golden in a dell of dew, scattering unbeholden its aerial hue among the flowers and the grass, which screen it from the view. So unseen, hidden, yet pouring out its light or its music from this unseen state. So the tension between the unseen and the seen, the unheard and the heard, right? Very important in the way in which you see the profusion of images in Shelley, the creation of the synesthesia, of the sound and the sights that he creates, that overflowing sense of the Skylark song is conveyed in the overflowing metaphors of the romantic poet. Like a rose embowered. So you see, you've had, maiden and music. So the sense of ear, the glowworm golden and the light of dew, sight. And now you've the sense of smell, like a rose embowered in its own green leaves, by the warm winds deflowered till the scent it gives makes faint with too much dose, heavy winged thieves. So the air is heavy, so the scent of smell. See how the synesthesia is operating in Shelley's poetry. And then comes the feeling and the sound of the vernal showers on the twinkling grass, rain awakened flowers. All that ever was, joyous and clear and fresh, thy music doth surpass. So once again, this sense of unbridled joy, blithe spirit. So the Skylark has access to a sublime world, a sublime fountain of joy, which the human cannot access. So Shelley suggests that there is this human world which is mixed with joy and sorrow, so that unmitigated sorrow is never possible. It is only through the poetic leap that this world of unbridled joy can be touched or felt. Teach us, sprite or bird, spirit in that sense. You see, you have to understand how Shelley periodically reminds us that the bird is, but is not. It is both a bird and a spirit. It is both a body and unbodied. It is both a presence and something beyond the presence. What sweet thoughts are thine? I have never heard praise of love or wine that painted forth a flood of rapture so divine. So, a state of intoxication that human beings come under, a state of love or a state of wine. The bird can leap across that human state of rapture and enter into a space of divine rapture, as it were. Right, so that's very interesting that Shelley uses. Chorus hymeneal, so the marriage songs, or triumphal chant of victory, victorious chants, matched with thine would be all but an empty vaunt, a thing wherein we feel that there is some hidden want. So now the poem has moved towards the description of a sense of fulfillment and happiness and joy and completion that the Skylark has, and that the human world will never sort of reach. What objects are the fountains of thy happy strain? What fields or waves or mountains? What shapes of sky or plain? What love of thine own kind? What ignorance of pain? So you see, question after question comes forth. And Shelley is trying to probe. And this is the probing in the world of the imagination of the Skylark as to what is that creative process. Right? And therefore, this poem is a very self-reflexive poem on the power of art, what can create that moment of sublimity in art, which goes beyond the human into the ethereal. Right? So it's a poem. The Skylark is not a poem about a bird at all. It is an interrogation into that precise condition and mechanism through which the poet can transform the real into the unreal, the real into the sublime. So it's a process, or it's an interrogation into the romantic creative sensibility. And you will find that all romantics, turn these poems inwards, right? So nature becomes inward in Wordsworth to create the perfect state of of love and being, of understanding the still sad music of humanity. Coleridge uses the supernatural to create this perfect world of beauty, and Shelley creates this, or uses this world of the Peterloo massacre and tyranny to create a perfect world of freedom. So romantic art essentially is narcissistic. It turns towards the subjective romantic imagination that Maurice Bora talks about, or it turns towards the inner lamp that M.H. Abrams talks about. It does not want to hold a mirror up to society. It wants to interrogate that magic lamp within the romantic poet's sensibility. Waking or asleep, thou of death must deem things more true and deep than we mortals dream. You remember the shadow of Shelley's young son's death is looming in the background. Or how could thy notes flow in such a crystal stream? And then comes one of romantic poetry's, world poetry's most beautiful lines. We look before and after and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. You see, the romantic sensibility is once again marked by this presence of sadness. In Wordsworth, the sad, still music of humanity. In Keats, the fever, the fret, and the palsy of life. In Shelley, the tones of life. In Coleridge, the hauntings of melancholy. Yet, it remains within the power of the romantic poet to transform this melancholia, or to transcend this space and sense of suffering, as even Lamb does, to create perfect worlds of art, acceptance, happiness, and perfection that Shelley dreams of. Yet if we could scorn, hate, and pride and fear, if we were things born not to shed a tear, I know not how thy joy we should ever come near. Better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found, thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground. So, bird thou never wert is the scorner of the ground. The way in which romantic art can transcend the world which is marked by suffering to reach a symbolic universe which is marked by perfection. And then once again, as Shelley goes on, he talks about, and as Shelley's poems frequently do, as we've seen in The West Wind in the fifth stanza, where the poet internalizes the west wind, be thou the impetuous one. So the poem is no longer now about the skylark in the last stanza. The poem is about the poet. I, the romantic subjective poet, teach me half the gladness. Be thou me. Make me thy lyre. Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. Now, the term harmonious madness is brought from Shelley. It's brought by Shelley from Plato's Phaedrus, 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 which Shelley had read in May 1819. Right, so in Shelley's Phaedrus, Socrates says that if anyone comes to the gates of poetry and expects to become an adequate poet by acquiring expert knowledge of the subject without the muse's madness, he will fail, and his self-controlled verses will be eclipsed by the poetry of men who have been driven out of their minds. So in Phaedrus, Shelley suggests that the greatest of poetry is driven by madness, is driven by inspiration rather than careful craft. Now contrast this with, say, a poet like Horace, who will talk about poetry as perfected by art. Plato suggests, on the other hand, that poetry is caused by a divine madness. And therefore, Shelley is bringing that idea of the harmonious madness into the romantic poet. But it's not a madness that is arbitrary or vague. It's a madness that provokes the secondary imagination of Coleridge to understand and synthesize the correlationships between random objects. I will remind you once again of Shelley's defense of poetry. But Shelley recognizes that language has the power to bring the disparate into a state of harmony. And it is the poet who has this special power to bring together language into a different order of harmony so that the prophetic can be gleaned, so that the state of perfection can be gleaned. So Shelley is here talking about the inspired, mad poet, fueled by the imagination. So Shelley's concept of poetry is not a poetry that can be marked by pure art. He suggests poetry will be spontaneous, poetry will be inspired, poetry will be imaginative, poetry will try and approach the sublime and the elusive, even if it takes off from the universe, as it were. So the skylark, therefore, becomes the symbol not of a bird at all, but of this heightened romantic, poetic sensibility and imagination through which a world of mundane reality can be transcended and leaped over to grasp or to touch a world that is marked by the sublime, that is marked by a state of perfection, that is a state of the perfect idea, and that is marked by unhappiness. Now, you can call this idealistic, and like Matthew Arnold, you can talk about Shelley as being this poet who sort of beautiful angel and a beautiful and ineffectual angel who beats his golden wings in vain. But you see, if you take a look at that poem which we read together, The Mask of Anarchy, and we talk about how Shelley is able to dream of an utopia of resistance, of non-violent protest, that will then transcend the potential of human violence, then we see how Shelley sees poetry as a vehicle that can move and transform society by projecting the utopia in front of it so that that becomes the ideal to strive. Now, it's interesting in the sense that is Shelley's poem explained. But I'll not stop here because I'd like to look at two other poems on the skylark. And the first of them is Wordsworth's To the Skylark. Right? Wordsworth too talks about the skylark as this celestial bird, ethereal minstrel, pilgrim of the sky. Dost thou despise the earth where cares abound? So a kind of similar, theme that Wordsworth draws upon, that the skylark is a bird that despises the world's, carefulness and moves into the carelessness. Or while the winds aspire and our heart and eye, both with the nest upon the dewy ground, thy nest which thou canst drop into at will, those quivering wings composed, that music still. So in Wordsworth, the bird is more rooted in reality. It frequently fits in between reality and the sublime. Whilst for Shelley, the skylark is a bird of the sky. It is the sublime. Leave to the nightingale her shady wood, a privacy of glorious light is thine. You see, in Shelley, the skylark is the bird which conceives the world of the idea. In Wordsworth, rather, the skylark is a figure of wisdom. But again, harmony is also another factor that Wordsworth brings into it. Flood of harmony with instinct more divine, type of the wise who soared but never rove. Right. So this concept of soaring into a world of knowledge, to be privy of a reality, or to be privy of some universe which the human is not privy to, is what links Wordsworth and Coleridge together. But for Wordsworth, the skylark is a figure of wisdom. For Shelley, it is more a world of happiness and utopia. That's the romantic sense. Now let me come back to a poem which is written almost 150 years after Shelley wrote his poem. And this is Thomas Hardy's poem titled Shelley's Skylark. Now you see, for those of you who have read a lot of poetry of Hardy, a lot of novels of Hardy, you'll find that Hardy exists in that twilight zone when the Victorian romantic sort of merges into the modern. And the modern, which is marked by a sense of the collapse of the belief in God, the belief in self, the world wars looming. So a crisis about the self, about the world as it were. And therefore, how does how does Hardy look at Shelley's Skylark? When at a moment when gloom, despondency, and a sense of vacuum and crisis and uncertainty, right? What Arnold will talk about in Dover Beach, the kind of fading light, fading beliefs, the crisis in a time of great uncertainty. How does Hardy look at Shelley's Skylark? And Hardy was visiting, Italy at this point of time, the same space where Shelley had written the Skylark. And Hardy writes, somewhere afield here, something lies in earth's oblivious, eyeless trust that moved a poet to the prophecies, a pinch of unseen, unguarded dust. So the Skylark, the physical Skylark, which Shelley had seen, is what Hardy is going back to, and which has become a pinch of dust, which is an inconsequential bird. Yet for the romantic poet, it had been a kind of object that had moved the poet of prophecies. The dust of the lark that Shelley heard and made immortal through times to be, though it only lived like another bird and knew not its immortality. So Hardy is turning back. Hardy is turning our attention back to the physical bird, which the poet made immortal, which the poet made a prophet, but which was in reality a small physical being, which was never immortal, lived its meek life, then one day fell, a little ball of feather and bone, and how it perished when unpiped farewell, and where its wastes are alike unknown. So it's, in this world of darkness, that it's an inconsequential bird. It is marked by inconsequentiality. It is marked by, ignominy. It is marked by unseenness. Maybe it rests in the loam I view, the grass. Maybe it throbs in nettles green. Maybe it sleeps in the coming hue of a grape in the slopes of yon inland scene. So Shelley once again Hardy once again is going back to that Arnoldian vision of the darkling plain, right, where ignorant armies fight by night. The sense of deep unrest, unease, and a sense of the deep inconsequentiality of man post Darwin. And Hardy is talking about the utter impossibility of that romantic dream. And he says, go find it, fairies, go and find a tiny pinch of priceless dust, and bring a casket silver lined and framed of gold that gems on crust. So Hardy is drawing this very sort of binary between the world of the poet, which is of Shelley, of romantics, which is still marked by innocence, still marked by brilliance, still marked by utopia, versus the modernist world, which is marked by uncertainty, doubt, and darkness. And we will lay it safe therein and consecrate it to endless time. For it inspired a bard to win ecstatic heights in thought and rhyme. Notice the kind of punning that Shelley has on that bird bard. For it inspired a bard to win ecstatic thoughts, heights in thought and rhyme. So Hardy is here clearly drawing the skylark as the poetic skylark as something that is essentially romantic, that is marked by an elusiveness, utopia, and sublimity, versus the skylark of Hardy's world, which is marked by inconsequentiality, which is marked by darkness, and which is marked by a gloom and mortality. Right. So you see, it's very interesting in the way I wanted to bring Hardy's poem into your consciousness, because between them, the two poets, as it were, look at two different world views. One of the modernist crisis, lack of confidence in man, dystopia, versus the romantic belief in a possibility of a sublime human world of freedom that is an utopia. Right. So between them, the bird symbolism and how it is changed throughout, with the change in the world of ideas, becomes very visible. Right. Now, I think we have taken a look very carefully at a lot of Shelley's poetry here. The Mask of Anarchy, the Ode to the West Wind, and To a Skylark. And I would like to draw a few concluding comments here that, Shelley's universe, therefore, is marked by the presence of the prophetic poet. Shelley does not see poetry as something that merely represents the universe. It creates a different mimetic order of reality. When I talked about romanticism, and when I talked about M.H. Abrahams's concept of the mirror and the lamp, of the imaginative as creating a different order of the universe that is marked by sublimity, that is marked by a distinction with the physical world, it is this mimetic order to which Shelley aspires to. Now, this mimetic order is also marked by a sense of revolution, by a sense of transformation in Shelley's poetry. Shelley recognizes that England of his time, Europe of his time, is marked by the presence of, a lot of strife, tyranny, denial, and crisis. But his poetry is meant as an antidote to this crisis. He seeks, as a poet, to enter into a zone of the revolutionary, where he'll interrogate the state of tyranny, depict it as a grotesque masquerade of anarchy, led by hypocrisy and fraud, and then try and transform this into the possible utopian world of freedom, anti-slavery, class, erasure, and equality. That is what the Mask of Anarchy looks at. When it sort of creates the specter which defeats anarchy, renews hope, And then Shelley lays an outline of how this program is to be achieved through passive nonviolence, through shaming the perpetrator, and through patience, fortitude, goodness, science, and poetry. Now, it is this program that the revolutionary poet seeks to lay before his audience. And therefore, it is this program that becomes the power of poetry to create an alternative sublime universe of the ideas and reach and lay before the audience an alternative reality. That is what is the purpose of the West Wind. That is what is the purpose of the Skylark, where ultimately the wind and the bird both represent the potential romantic creative sensibility. And therefore, the physical object of science, of the world, the wind and the bird, are ultimately internalized into the selfhood of the poet, who can then create this world of harmonious madness, but who at every point of time is thwarted by suffering, falls upon the thorns of life, and therefore needs the inspiration for the imagination to function. Therefore, it is this aspect of poet Shelley's poetic universe, the way in which the poet requires inspiration and imagination and can dream of and create that magical world of the lamp, which will create a sublime universe in contrast to the mundane universe. And ultimately, it will be poetry's power to dream and to move, to create alternative realities, which mankind can aspire to. Now, you can call Shelley ineffectual. You can call Shelley a dreamer. You can call Shelley an sort of angel beating his wings in vain. But this is the creative theory behind Shelley's poetry. Now, also remember something, that in order to create this universe, and in order to create this motion or the leap from the mundane to the sublime, Shelley requires poetic forms. Shelley requires a special language, a language which is marked by a dynamism, which is marked by an overflow of the presence of images of light and soaring, of motion and unrest. That's what the West Wind does. Of soaring and light, that's what both the Mask of Anarchy as well as the Skylark does. And a sense of plenitude, and therefore repeated metaphors. Now, you have wondered, of course, why does Shelley have to bring in the world of the sky, earth, and water in the West Wind? Why does Shelley create image after image in the Skylark of the rose, of the glowworm, of the breeze, and the vernal showers? It is because Shelley sees, nature as a repository through which humanity can strive at the plenitude of ideas. So there is an equation in Shelley between the plenitude within the universe, which he observes with great scientific accuracy, and the plenitude in the history of the idea. So Shelley's movement is continuously in a dialectics with the storm within nature, with the light within nature, that he can then transfer into the world of poetry and ideas. And therefore, nature becomes, in a different way, a vehicle of revolution to Shelley, in the way in which Wordsworth dreams of nature as a kind of a sort of antidote, a kind of a balm, a cure, a nurse. Shelley sees nature as a potential revolutionary that is always creating and destroying, that is always bringing in energy, right? And therefore, Shelley brings in that energy of imagery profusion within nature. Also, therefore, to bring in this element of the force of nature, the revolutionary zeal. He will use forms like the terza rima. He will use the forms like the lyric and lengthen out the Alexandrine in the Skylark poem so that the ideas themselves can then be grafted. The ideas then be sort of delivered and hammered into the consciousness of the listener. It is this kind of complex interplay between the world of the idea and the world of poetic creativity, technical brilliance that makes Shelley's poetry probably the most dynamic of the Romantic poets. And it is here in this zeal, force, and complex interplay between revolutionary idea, and the use of some classical yet forceful forms that you see Shelley's creative output lies. Friends, we've had quite a large discussion of Shelley. Between 1819 and 1820, the most powerful phase of Shelley's creativity. We've referred to Prometheus Unbound, of course, as the other text, which I'm sure you'll take up in your postgraduate years and see how Shelley works that in. But this interplay between revolutionary zeal, the image of the poet as the prophet, the reliance on nature as providing the symbolic object of poetry, and then create this world of ideas of freedom, liberty, equality, that Shelley's poetry becomes such a very complex, or becomes such complex artifacts. It is with those comments then that I will bring this discussion on Shelley to an end. Thank you for your patience and kindly listening in to this lecture. And it is with this that I bring the course on Shelley also to a close. Thank you very much.